He had written the advertisement himself, plain as a fence post. Wanted, a wife of sound sense who can rope, cook, and keep a homestead. No frills, no foolishness. Apply Garrity, Pintail Flats. So when the stage rocked to a stop in a boil of dust, and the woman who stepped down wore a traveling dress the improbable color of a robin's egg, with a hatbox in one gloved hand, and a look about her as though she had never roped anything in her life but a compliment, Mac Garrity knew in his bones that somewhere a mistake had been made, and that the mistake was about to be his to sort out. "You'll be Mr. Garrity," she said, before he could get a word out. She had a voice that carried without seeming to try, warm and pitched like the low notes of a fiddle, and she used it to look him up and down the way a horse trader sizes a mare. "You're taller than your letter. Your letter was quite short." "So was the point of it," Mac said. "Ma'am, I believe there's been an error. I wrote for a woman who could rope, cook, and keep a homestead. No frills, no foolishness. I have the whole thing by heart. I read it a great many times on the train." She set down her hatbox and put out a slim gloved hand, as though presenting it for admiration rather than a shake. "Cordelia Ruskin. Cordy, if we're to be married, which I gather from your face, you have already decided against. You may as well know at the outset, Mr. Garrity, I cannot rope. I have never in my life kept a homestead, and the one time I attempted to cook, a church supper very nearly disbanded over it." Max stared at her. "Then why in the world," he said, "did you answer an advertisement that asked for exactly those three things?" Something flickered behind the brightness of her, quick as a swallow, there and gone. "Because," she said, "it was the one advertisement in the whole paper that asked for a woman who could do plain, honest things, instead of a woman who could sing." And she picked her hatbox back up and looked at him, chin high, daring him to send her back onto the stage. He did not send her back. He told himself later, it was only because the stage had already gone, rattling off toward the next town in its own dust, and a man could not very well leave a woman standing in the road at Pintail Flats. That was the reason he gave. It was not the whole of the reason, and Mac Garrity, who prided himself on plain dealing, knew it even as he loaded her ridiculous hatbox into the wagon bed beside the flour and the fence wire. She talked the whole 4 miles out to the homestead. He learned, without meaning to, that she had sung 6 nights a week in a variety hall in a city he'd never seen, that the manager had lately taken to deciding what else she owed him besides her songs, and that she had packed a bag one night between acts, and walked out the stage door and kept walking, until a train and then a stage had carried her to the emptiest, plainest, farthest off place a newspaper advertisement could take her. She told it lightly, the way she seemed to tell everything. But Mac had spent his life reading weather and stock and men, and he heard the thing under the lightness, the same way you hear thunder a county off on a still day. "So you ran," he said. "I retired," said Cordy Ruskin, "from the singing profession, to take up ranching." She looked out at the flats, the great brown roll of them going on to the mountains, emptier than anything she had ever seen, and for one unguarded moment, her bright face was simply tired. "How hard can it be," she said, "if all it wants is sense?" Mac did not laugh. He'd meant to. Instead, he found himself saying, "Gruff, it wants a sight more than sense. But sense is the part most folks show up without, so you're ahead of where you think." She looked at him sidelong, surprised, as though she had not expected kindness from a fence post. And Mac looked back at the mule's ears, and felt his neck go hot, and could not for the life of him have said why. She was, as promised, a catastrophe. She burned the first 3 suppers black, and served the 4th half raw, and apologized for neither, only laughed at herself in a way that made it impossible to be cross. She tried to milk the cow, and got herself kicked into the straw, and came up with straw in her hair, and her dignity somehow entirely intact. She could not throw a loop to save her soul. The rope seemed to regard her as an enemy. Mac found himself, over the course of a fortnight, doing the roping and a good deal of the cooking and most of the milking, and telling himself daily that this arrangement made no sense whatsoever and could not continue, and continuing it. Because the thing was, and he turned it over at night in the loft, unable to make it come out even, The homestead had grown warmer since she came. Not easier, warmer. She could not cook, but she had scrubbed the neglected little house till it shone and put a jar of wild larkspur on the table, and she could not rope, but she learned the mules' names in a day and sang to them while she forked their hay, low and easy, and the mules, contrary beasts that had never loved anyone, followed her along the fence like dogs. She could not do one useful thing he had advertised for. And Mac Garrity, coming in cold and tired at dusk to a swept house and a bad supper, and the sound of a woman humming, found he did not want to advertise for anything ever again. There was an evening in that first fortnight he kept, without meaning to, like a stone in his pocket. He had been out mending the north fence past dark, and come in bone-weary and short-tempered, and found the supper, a thing that had aspired to be a stew, sitting scorched and forlorn on the stove, and Cordy sitting at the table, with her chin in her hands, and her city bravado all run out of her at last. "I have decided," she announced, "that I am a fraud, Mr. Garrity, and you may put me on the next stage with a clear conscience. I have burned your supper and frightened your cow, and I nearly set the wash on fire, and a woman who cannot do a single plain, honest thing has no business pretending she can be plain and honest." Mac looked at the scorched stew. He looked at the swept floor, and the mended curtains she'd made out of a flour sack, and the jar of larkspur, and the woman herself, worn through and trying not to show it. He took off his hat and sat down across from her. "You want to know the plainest, honestest thing there is?" he said. "It's staying. 100 folks can rope. Not near so many can pack a bag in the dark and walk out the one door and keep walking to a place they never saw, because the life they had wasn't fit to keep. That took more sand than roping ever did." He pushed the scorched pot aside. "I'll cook. You've got the harder thing already in you, and it can't be taught." Cordy Ruskin looked at him a long moment across the lamplit table, and for once in her quick-tongued life, she did not have one word to say. The neighbor woman came calling that same week, Mrs. Pruitt from the next section over, who had opinions and enjoyed the airing of them, and had come chiefly to see the songbird everyone at the settlement was talking of. She sat in the swept little kitchen and looked Cordy over and remarked, sweet as vinegar, that she'd heard Mr. Garrity had sent clear off for a wife who could rope and cook, and wasn't it a curiosity that he'd got one who could do neither, and whatever did a man want with a wife like that? Mac was in the doorway with an armload of wood. He set it down slow. "What I want with her, Mrs. Pruitt," he said, in the flat, even voice the whole flats had learned not to argue with, "is my own affair, and I find I've got no complaint to lay before the neighborhood. She kept a lamp burning for me at the church supper, you'll recall you didn't. Now we're obliged for the call." And he held the door, plain as that, until Mrs. Pruitt gathered her indignation and her shawl, and took them both back where they'd come from. Cordy watched the wagon go, then turned and looked at Mac Garrity, as though seeing him new. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," Mac agreed, and picked his wood back up, and would not meet her eye. "Reckon I wanted to." The turn came on the night of the grass fire. A dry lightning storm walked across the flats near midnight, and set the west pasture alight, and Mac was out of the house and onto a horse before he'd got his boots buckled, and Cordy, who did not know the first thing about anything, did the one thing that mattered, which was not to faint or flap, but to ask him fast and level, "What do you need? Tell me plain," and then do it. She hauled water. She soaked sacks in the trough, and beat at the creeping line of fire beside him for 2 hours in the dark and the smoke, her robin's egg city dress ruined past saving, her hands blistering, and she did not once complain or quit. When at last the wind turned and the rain came, and the fire hissed down into black stubble, the two of them stood in the smoking pasture, soaked and filthy and gasping, and Cordy Ruskin pushed her ruined hair out of her face and started helplessly to laugh. "You are the strangest woman I have ever known," Mac said, staring at her. "I know it," she gasped. "I've retired from singing to beat out fires with a wet sack in the dark. My old manager would perish." And then the laughing turned, the way it does when a body is worn all the way through, and there were tears on her sooty face, and Mac Garrity did the only sensible thing a plain man could do, which was to close the space between them and put his arms around her, careful of her blistered hands, and hold her steady while the rain came down. "You could rope by fall if you'd let me teach you," he said into her smoky hair, which was not at all what he had meant to say. "I've a notion you learn fast when a thing matters." Cordy went still against him. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Garrity?" she said, "because it is the worst one in the history of the institution." "It's a beginning of one," Mac said. "I'll do the rest of it better when I've had sleep and you've had a supper somebody else cooked." He did do the rest of it better. He did it a week on, when the pasture was already greening up out of the black, and he had washed and put on his good shirt and stood turning his hat in his hands on the swept porch like a boy. He told her he had written that advertisement for a woman who could rope and cook and keep a homestead because he had thought that was what a lonesome man out on the flats needed, and that he had been wrong clear down to the ground. What he had needed, it turned out, was a woman who would ask, "What do you need? Tell me plain," in the middle of a fire, and stay. What he had needed was somebody who could make a swept house feel like a place a man wanted to come home to. What he had needed, though he'd had no words for it in any advertisement, was her. "I can't cook," Cordy warned him. Her eyes were very bright. "We'll neither of us starve," Mac said. "I cook fine. I can't rope. I'll teach you, or I won't, and we'll have the one roper this outfit needs, which is me. I sing," she said, softer, as though confessing the one thing she had run 400 miles to stop being. "I can't seem to help it. I'll sing to your mules and your fence posts, and likely your children, if it comes to that, whether you want the racket or no." Mac Garrity, plain homesteader, who had advertised in black and white for no frills and no foolishness, looked at the Runaway Songbird standing on his porch in the last gold light off the pintail flats, and felt his whole careful, sensible heart go clean over the fence. "Sing then," he said, rough and low. "I find I've grown partial to the racket." They were married that autumn at the little church past the flats, and Cordy Ruskin, who never did learn to cook worth a thing, learned to throw a passable loop by the following spring, and to sit a horse, and to birth a calf in the cold before dawn. And Mac learned that a house is not kept warm by roping or cooking at all, but by the sound of somebody in it who is glad to be there. She sang at their wedding, the one time, and grown ranch hands who had never wept at anything wept at that. And on winter evenings ever after, when the wind came down off the flats, and Mac sat mending harness by the fire, his wife would take up some low, easy tune at the stove, over a supper he would end up finishing himself, and he would look up at her and think that he had written that advertisement asking for all the wrong things, and been sent, by whatever grace looks after plain lonesome men, exactly the right one.